I like a phrase I learned from an African leader. He said, invite people to the kitchen, don't invite them to the table. So when I'm in the kitchen, I view the food very, very differently. I'm not judging the food as a consumer. I help to make it.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to season 3 of the Intentional Churches podcast. My name is Erin Johnston, and I'm here with a couple of my friends today. I've got Doug Parks from IC. Hey Doug, what's up?
Hey Erin, great to see you again. Can't wait to get into a great convo today.
And we're here also with our friend Dano. Dano is one of my good friends. He's a movement catalyst, gardener extraordinaire, all sorts of great things to know about my friend Dan. But Dan, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself? Who are you? Help our listeners know just who is Dano.
Well, I had many years of church pastoral experience at Canyon Ridge, along with Doug, and I did that for about 8 years. And then we went to South Asia and catalyzed movements or helped start movements of disciples and churches among Muslim peoples. And now we're back here in Vegas and connecting with you guys. Mostly what I say about what I do is that I grow my fruit and other people's trees.
Yes, that's awesome. Literally and figuratively. Well, we in this season are talking about just what are the questions that church leaders are asking? What are the challenges that church leaders are facing? And we're trying to just wrap our arms around, tackle some of these questions, some of these challenges. And so today, I really want to focus our conversation around this idea of collaboration and working well together across teams. One of the things that I know many church leaders experience, I'm sure for many of our listeners, is this idea of silos on our teams. Like you've got the youth person working only on youth ministry, right? And you've got the engagement person working only on engagement ministry. And you've got the groups person, so on and so forth. And we just know, I think we're learning all the time that silos don't serve anyone. When it's time to make decisions, or we want to create something new, or we want to take ground together, or even in the way that intentional churches, some of the words that they use is like when we're looking for breakthrough, when we're seeking breakthrough in a particular challenge, we need to work together. And Dan, I know you have done a lot of work in this idea of collaboration. And so maybe would you just start by telling us, I know you don't use the word collaboration, you use a different word, which is co-creation. Would you just help invite our listeners into, as we start the conversation of how are we going to eliminate silos and help people work together? Talk to us about some of the language and vocab you use as you think about this conversation.
Well, co-creation and or collaboration, it's really getting everybody in the system, everybody in the organization, everybody in the space involved and engaged, and not leaving anybody out. What we've found is even after 500 years of the Protestant Reformation, maybe one of the most missing components is the priesthood of all believers. And that can even happen on a staff where all of the energy, all of the creativity, all of the initiative is locked up in a few influential leaders with authority instead of diffused throughout each department. The sense of awakening, what we're really trying to talk about is awakening agency at the bottom and the edge of the organization, initiative and creativity at the bottom and the edge of the organization.
Yeah, that's really good. And so co-creation is all about helping every person bring their God-given contribution to the table and not just a select few experts to use their influence and their initiative. Doug, maybe help us translate this into the language you use at Intentional Churches. How do you think about this idea of collaboration or co-creation?
Well, Erin, I do want to back up first and say we've talked a lot about ministry departments and the siloing in between ministry departments, but in our work, we also see it in much smaller churches that might be committee-based or team-based, where people are, because they're passionate about a topic like missions or Bible studies or something, they may be in a committee that's working on that. And oftentimes those committees silo as well. And so this problem of siloing in church runs rampant. Whether you're small church, big church, doesn't matter, and there are different nuances to how we solve each. But at the end of the day, what Dan said, it would be the approach of intentional churches. Structurally, your organization, however it's built, with volunteer leadership, paid staff, whatever, has to be built with a component of cross-functionality. That's the word we use, cross-ministry function, that is working on different things than, for instance, a ministry silo would. Because, for years, I hated ministry silos. I tried to eradicate them. But at the end of the day, they do have a place in our organizations. They provide hierarchy. They provide, we often say at IC, they help drive a topic or an issue to excellence. We want people from children's ministry working on making children's ministry awesome. But this idea that we're talking about with Dan, cross-functionality, cross-ministry attacking, from our viewpoint, puts siloing in its correct place in the organization.
Okay. Yeah. So we want people still fulfilling the role. If we're thinking about a church staff for a moment, we want people fulfilling the role that they were hired to fulfill, right? So if someone is just amazing at children's ministry, they should continue to be amazing at children's ministry. And
Yes.
We want all the good from them towards that end. And also, everyone should be able to and equipped and really unleashed to contribute their God-given gifts in multiple directions.
Amen.
Dan, why don't we kind of move into how do you start to do this? So if you say you had big church, small church, anywhere in between, that was really hoping to set out in the direction of like much greater collaboration, cross-functionality, co-creation, any of these words that we're kind of using interchangeably. How does that look? How do you think about that? What should be the first couple steps that a team does? And then maybe that can help us start to help people kind of think about this in their own context.
Well, I like a phrase I learned from an African leader. He said, invite people to the kitchen, don't invite them to the table. So when you invite someone to the table, someone else makes the food. You're asked how you like it. And when others are invited to the table, you become the entertainer and they become consumer. You're the host or the hostess and they're the guest. And in fact, in churches, we call people guests all the time. And sometimes people become perennial guests because our membership classes are one directional and we talk at people, and our invitations to volunteer are mostly filling holes. They're definitely not characterized by collaboration and engagement. On the other side, when you invite people to the kitchen, what happens when you invite people to the kitchen? That family and friends come into the kitchen. You make yourself at home, but you're also expected to clean up the mess and help with part of the cooking. So when I'm in the kitchen, I view the food very, very differently. I'm not judging the food as a consumer. I helped make it. So my engagement is off the charts. I'm going to give you my full attention when you lead because I expect the same when I'm leading. And whenever you're invited to the kitchen, it's getting past this idea of professional chefs. No one's always doing the cooking while everybody else is relaxing on a glass of wine. We still need the supportive, experienced cooks that kind of frame the menu or bring their know-how, but everybody's involved in the process. Another way to think about it, and a way that I have a friend who's engaged in like inner city church work, and they call their neighborhood their people garden. And so another way to describe this is that we invite everybody into the kitchen to bring all the ingredients from their own gardens, and we make something together that the community can only be birthed from the community itself. And I think what that does is it invites people out of guest, consumer, critique mode, and invites them to bring their contribution. And that's what we're really all about, is trying to find ways to unlock contribution from everybody that's involved in the community.
That's great. I'm wondering for our listeners, especially, that sounds like such a good idea, but what are the kinds of things that we need this type of collaboration or cross-functionality around? Doug, maybe you would speak to this for a moment as you help people into this with intentional churches, what are the types of maybe issues or challenges or things that you advise teams to really use this method with?
Yeah, in our work, we're going to one of the biggest hurdles we face in church leadership is we don't understand a couple of points of emphasis. Number one, ministry is a zero sum proposition. We use that phrase a lot. And what we mean by it is a friend of ours says there is no innocent yes. And at the same time, everything in ministry is important all the time. We treat it as if we have an endless supply of resource. So we say yes to way too many things. And then at the same time, we say it's all equally as important. And so the way we like to think about this and how you utilize this tool of, and I love Dan's word of co-creation, collaboration, this cross functionality, is we're using it to set in place prioritization and sequencing. And that is a new discipline for most church leaders to learn, to say in this next season's work, of the 10 or 20 things we could do, these one or two things are the most important. And then we're going to deploy cross ministry, cross functionality against that, a team made up of people from outside of the silos to go attack that work. And so you can't do, I don't believe you don't have the enough bandwidth and space to do 10 or 20 of these teams at one time, but you have to be focused in on a priority and sequence, taking the long view in ministry. Think about how much we can accomplish over the next 10 years, as opposed to kind of the silver bullet mentality we all have, microwave ministry, that we could just fix everything in the next 30 days, that kind of approach. So,
Yeah, just getting super practical to what you both have said. I think about, like, in my context, last year we just realized, man, we need a new approach to volunteers. Uh, we need a better way to get volunteers, recruit them. We need a better way to train them, and we really want to train them with our DNA, which is really important to who we're becoming. So they're not just warm bodies, doing a role on a Sunday morning, but they really understand what it means to make disciples who make disciples, and they understand what we mean when we say that. And so we put one of these cross-functional teams together, a co-creation team, and came together and said, let's kind of eliminate everything that is, and let's start from scratch. And we had people from all different ministries and areas across our church, which was really important for the creation of a whole new volunteer pipeline and all of those things. But it wouldn't have been possible without multiple areas of ministry represented. I also want to point to something else, Dano, that I've heard you talk about before. And that is the difference between, like, this idea of collaboration, co-creation, and just like telling people something or selling people something, or just having people consult you on your ideas that you already have. What's the difference between true collaboration, like inviting a team to really build something together, or the leadership just kind of inviting some people from the team to consult them on their ideas? I want our listeners to make sure they catch the difference here. Dan, would you flesh that out for us?
Well, every one of the kinds of leadership mindsets that you can show up as, and we developed like a spectrum from telling and selling all the way up to co-creation. What we found is mostly these days people kind of sniff out telling and realize that's not really good. It's not going to get the job done. But selling has never been more popular. But what happens when a leader sells the vision? They're creating consumers of the vision. If you sell the vision, you're having to convince people to go after what's, I almost want to ask, what's the most important thing everybody's trying to garner in a meeting? Leaders are trying to garner in a meeting, and it's ownership. But if you try to sell people to own the vision, then you're constantly trying to get them to continue that process. But co-creation is a mindset, and it's the most developed kind of leader that can kind of manage their own anxiety and be present to the team or the congregation and invite them into the journey courageously and patiently. And for most leaders, it really brings out a lot of insecurity, especially if they're just being driven by busyness to chase this ownership, when reality, it's something that is developed over time, and you have to take small steps to invite, followers or people on your team into the really scary place of being part of owning the consequences of the outcome. That's why I oftentimes feel like point leaders in churches, they're pushed further and further up into situations that are really precarious. They put their own souls are very precarious when they're responsible for so much. And then, of course, if they fall, it has such a big impact on the organization, on the church, on the community. But that doesn't have to be the case if they share that sense of ownership. They invite people into the experience of walking along with them and bearing the unbearable burden of the consequences of what we're doing. That work has a lot to do with what's happening in the interior life of the leader. And I found that only the most developed leaders can kind of manage that. It's much easier I go into my cave, I figure out what, me and God want to do, and I come out and announce it. But that kind of installed change requires constant attention to keep ownership high, as opposed to making space in a wider group of people. Not everybody, but increasingly wider groups of people to be able to be part of creating the vision together. And then also what that does is when we hit the adaptive challenges in front of us, challenges that we didn't anticipate and we didn't know how to approach, everybody carries the DNA of the vision in a much more embedded way, so they can adapt at the edges without the leader being the only one that sets the agenda or solves the problem.
Well, Erin, and Dan, I just think, Dan, what you're saying is so spot on, because especially in the American church, the responsibility issue when you're in the mantle of senior leadership or executive team leadership of a church, and you introduce a concept like co-creation or a strategy about how we're going to go about doing something, it really is, there's a whole lot of fear that can kick in, because my experience has been when we get into collaborative environments, excellence levels will tend to drop a little. Patience levels have to grow. Ego and internal identity issues are being challenged, not just for the senior leader, but for maybe the team member who really
Absolutely.
feels judged, and their identity and worth comes from performance. And am I going to fail? Or are you going to? So there's all this stirring up that goes on when you go down this road. However, what you said, Dan, the power in ownership, buy-in, alignment over the long haul is worth the price to pay. Not even considering the developmental side as a disciple, what it's doing to challenge our identity issues across the board, but organizationally, the ground we can take over time, we actually can go faster the more we embed this kind of DNA in our churches. So anyway, I loved your analogy of the kitchen versus the table, because I think that is very pertinent to what this conversation is developing into.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, at first, this will not be quick. This will take way longer at first, and it will be really easy to want to throw in the towel. Co-creation sounds nice. Then you get into an actual co-creation environment and you're like, oh my goodness, here we are several weeks later, and we're just now, forming our conclusions or whatever, making a decision or whatever the case might be. And I will just say it's worth it because it begins to change your culture. And once, not just your staff members, but even congregants, even key volunteers, once they feel like I have a place in the kitchen here, not just at the table, not just to show up on a Sunday morning and consume what you have prepared for me, but I have a seat or a place in the kitchen, that really begins to change. Like Dan was saying, how people show up, how they arrive, the amount of ownership that they carry with them, the amount of freedom they feel to act and to do what they sense that God's called them to do. So I think that's just really helpful. I want to get hyper practical for a minute for our listeners, for somebody who's like, okay, we have maybe a challenge in front of us, or maybe we want to take some new ground. What would be the first 3 practical steps you would advise that someone take? Or I'm going to give you both a couple options and you can choose, and then the other person can take the other. What are a few questions that a leader should be asking themselves of themselves or their organization to know where they're at in this whole collaborative co-creation conversation, whether they need to take more ground, whether they need to start from the beginning, whether they need to work on themselves internally. Like, what are some key questions a leader should be asking? And or what are the first 3 steps a leader should be taking to head in the direction of greater co-creation and collaboration? Dan, will you start us out? You can pick if you want to ask questions or give 3 steps.
This doesn't seem fair.
How about this? I'm gonna take my autonomy and express it. I'm gonna tell a story that really does embed the 3 steps, if you will. So around Cane Ridge, right after, kind of in the midst of COVID, is when I came back to the U.S. and I was just asking around, my home church. So how do you guys do corporate discernment? How do you discern together what God's inviting us into in the next season or for the next year? And there was a lot of crickets, because there wasn't a lot of corporateness to it. And so Erin was a part of this, and obviously Drew and many others. But we began co-creating or bringing together cross-functionality of a wide group of staff. And that included even some people from the janitorial staff. We really wanted to push the boundaries of who we assumed should be in the room, and even brought some elders in. Every one of them had to go do interviews from uncommon voices in the congregation. So they were not just the key volunteers who already know us, they're really closely, but further in, just new believers, maybe even outliers. Everybody was intended to get 5 to 8 interviews. They would listen really well to what was happening in congregation, and then they would carry that sacredness of those voices to our seasonal discernment times, which is an actual meeting. Every one of them would have to write an independent 250-word summary of their summary work, and then 3 words or phrases that were birthed in prayer and listening to God, based on what they heard at the edges from real people in the congregation and what they sensed from the Lord. And this output was compiled without any names. This is the part of the cross-functionality that's really hard to endure when you're a person with authority. We had no names on any of the outputs so that those people with authority couldn't garner outsized influence. What we didn't want them to go is, oh, what's the senior pastor think? Well, I want to agree with that. Instead, nobody knew whose contribution was coming, and that really kept from any monopolizing conversations, and it really pushed us to listen really well to each other. And of course, we took substantial time. Maybe I shouldn't say of course. We took substantial time listening to God in those meetings. For some people, an awkward amount of listening because the practice of personal discernment wasn't as common. But noticing patterns across the summaries of all that was heard in the congregation. Then, of course, there was people with the gift of synthesis, and they helped to clarify those major themes that we might pursue in the next 3, 6, maybe 12 months. But what the result was of this cross-functional, co-creation kind of team was vision and direction was tethered to our shared understanding of our deepest values, the DNA of who we are, and we were still connected to and what was sensed by the interviews at the edges. It wasn't something birthed in a boardroom, or it wasn't birthed in a pastor study. It was birthed in really listening well. And we were able to say, and I think we still regularly are able to say with confidence and integrity, that we are co-creating a future we sense the Lord is calling us into, and that our congregation is hungry for.
Oh, so good. Doug, what would you add in terms of questions or that leaders should be asking, or even a first few practical steps that they should be taking based on this story from Dan?
Yeah, well, it's an incredible story, because most churches we go to have no systematic approach or a way that they're going to corporately discern. I'm going to back up to just some real practical things I've learned on how to implement. In our world, we call these projects that we're going to work on VIPs. You don't need to worry about the term, but in essence, we give a name to the cross-functional projects. If you've read 4 Disciplines of Execution, they're called WIGs. If you've done any kind of StratOps stuff, they're called WINs. Everybody has their different thing. But here's what I've learned is that teams do need to feel like they are winning. And so for me, when teams go attack co-creation in the beginning, I actually like for it to be a little bit of a smaller project. I try to stay away from philosophical. Like we're not here to be philosophically wandering in the desert for the next 5 months, and getting practicing the muscle at the same time. A team needs to feel like it's winning, because too many times I've set teams up to fail where the thing they were tackling was so big out of the gate and they'd never practiced co-creation. And so, so those would be a couple pragmatic ones. I think the main question, Erin, I would be asking around this topic, there's probably dozens if we had more time, but I think I would be asking, if I were a senior leader who had influence, how committed am I really? How committed is our organization really to the development of people into their best contributions? And do I care more about outcomes than I care about the development of people? Again, if you take the long haul view, we are in the people development under Jesus' sovereignty business. And if I take a longer view, I get less antsy about, hey, what did I accomplish or achieve in this little 3 or 6 month window? Even though I'm impatient myself, by the way, I struggle with this. So,
Yeah. Well, this has been so helpful. Just for our listeners, our encouragement to you would be to take the question that Doug just asked. How committed are all of us to the development of people bringing their best contribution over just our outcomes or our best laid plans? And then start looking around. Where can you start inviting people to the kitchen and not just to the table? Where can you invite people to roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty alongside you, and really start thinking about maybe a small step in the direction of co-creation or collaboration? I think all of our churches, and really beyond our churches, the kingdom of God is better when every person is able to bring their full God-given contribution. So Doug, Dano, thank you so much for a great conversation today. This has been fun. Good to hang with both of you. And thanks everyone for listening to the Intentional Churches podcast. We'll see you soon.